The winter of 1945 settled over Bavaria like a shroud, heavy with snow and heavier with dread. Heinrich Müller stood at the edge of his wheat field, watching the horizon where smoke from distant battles stained the sky a perpetual gray. He was 53 years old, his hands gnarled from decades of working the land, his face carved with lines that told stories of harvest and loss. The war had taken his eldest son 2 years prior at Stalingrad, and his wife had followed shortly after, her heart simply giving out under the weight of grief. Now, Heinrich lived alone on the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations, tending his fields and livestock with a methodical devotion that kept the demons of loneliness at bay. The village of Rothhausen lay 3 kilometers to the east, its church steeple visible on clear days, but Heinrich rarely ventured there anymore. The Nazi officials who had taken control of the local government made him uneasy with their fervent speeches and suspicious eyes. The sound of aircraft engines had become commonplace, a constant reminder that the world beyond his fields was tearing itself apart. Heinrich had learned to distinguish between German fighters and Allied bombers by the pitch and rhythm of their motors. On this particular March evening, the drone overhead was unmistakably American. Heavy bombers returning from a raid deeper into Germany, their formations ragged and desperate. He watched as anti-aircraft fire erupted from the valley below, orange tracers cutting through the twilight like angry hornets. 3 of the massive aircraft were hit almost simultaneously, their engines erupting in flames that were visible even at distance. Heinrich's stomach tightened as he saw parachutes begin to bloom against the darkening sky, white mushrooms drifting down toward his land. He counted them carefully, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else he could not quite name. 12 chutes in total spread across the wind, descending toward his farm and the surrounding forest with an inevitability that made his hands shake. The first pilot landed in the south pasture, his parachute dragging him across the frozen ground until he managed to release the harness. Heinrich approached cautiously, his hunting rifle held loosely in one hand, more for show than intent. The young man struggled to his feet, his flight suit torn and bloodied, his face pale with shock and pain. He could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, with sandy hair and frightened blue eyes that darted around the landscape looking for threats. When he saw Heinrich approaching, he raised his hand slowly, wincing at the movement. The farmer stopped 10 paces away, studying the boy who stood before him, shivering in the cold. For a long moment, neither spoke, the gulf of language and war stretching between them like an ocean. Then Heinrich lowered his rifle and gestured toward the barn with a tilt of his head. The young pilot's eyes widened with uncertainty and desperate hope, but he followed when Heinrich turned and began walking. Throughout that night, Heinrich moved across his property with a purpose that bordered on reckless. He found the other pilots scattered across his land and the adjacent forest, some injured, all terrified and confused. He gathered them one by one, using gestures and the few English words he remembered from before the war to communicate his intentions. They were all so young, these boys who had been raining death on German cities just hours before. One had a broken arm, another a gash across his forehead that bled steadily down his face. A third could barely walk, his ankle twisted badly in the landing. Heinrich helped each of them to the barn, his mind racing with the enormity of what he was doing. The penalty for harboring enemy soldiers was death, not just for him, but potentially for anyone in the village who might be deemed complicit. SS patrols regularly swept the countryside looking for deserters and partisans, and they would show no mercy if they discovered what Heinrich was hiding. The barn was large and old, built by his grandfather in 1893 from thick oak timbers that had weathered generations of storms. Heinrich led the pilots to the back section where he stored hay and grain, and there he began to construct their hiding place. He worked through the night, driven by an urgency he did not fully understand, moving hay bales to create a false wall that concealed a space large enough for 12 men to hide. The pilots watched him work, some helping where they could despite their injuries, others simply sitting in stunned silence as the reality of their situation settled over them. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Heinrich stood back and examined his work. The false wall looked convincing enough, indistinguishable from the rest of the hay storage unless someone knew exactly where to look. He gestured for the pilots to move behind it, then carefully rebuilt the facade, leaving only a small gap near the floor for air circulation. As he stepped back, he realized he had just committed himself to a path from which there could be no return. The first week was the hardest, a constant dance with death that left Heinrich sleeping in brief, fitful intervals. He maintained his normal routine as much as possible, tending to his livestock and working his fields, all while his mind remained fixated on the barn and the men hidden within it. Twice, SS patrols came through, their vehicles kicking up mud and gravel as they searched for the missing Allied airmen. Heinrich met them at the gate with the practiced deference of a man who understood the cost of appearing anything less than cooperative. He answered their questions with careful simplicity, explaining that he had seen the parachutes, but they had landed far from his property, perhaps in the forest to the north. The officers searched his barn with a thoroughness that made his heart hammer against his ribs, but they found nothing. The false wall held, and the pilots remained silent behind it, barely breathing as boots echoed through the structure mere feet from their position. When the patrols finally left, Heinrich allowed himself to exhale, though he knew they would return. Feeding 12 men on wartime rations required creativity and sacrifice that pushed Heinrich to the limits of his resources. His own meals became sparse, little more than thin soup and stale bread, while he diverted everything else to the barn. He slaughtered one of his pigs, something he had been saving for spring, and divided the meat into portions that would last as long as possible. He brought them water from his well in milk cans, sneaking out in the darkest hours of night when the risk of observation was lowest. The pilots had organized themselves into a kind of informal hierarchy, with a captain named Robert serving as their spokesman. Robert had a rudimentary grasp of German, learned from his grandmother, who had immigrated to America before the First War, and through him, Heinrich was able to communicate basic information and warnings. They told him their stories in broken fragments of language and gesture, tales of missions flown and friends lost, of homes in places with names like Iowa and Tennessee and Massachusetts, of families who had no idea whether they were alive or dead. As the days stretched into a second week, the dynamic between Heinrich and his hidden guests evolved from fearful necessity into something approaching mutual respect. The pilots understood the magnitude of the risk he was taking, and they did everything possible to minimize the burden of their presence. They kept noise to an absolute minimum, speaking only in whispers, if at all. They took turns keeping watch through the small gaps in the hay bales, alert for any sign of danger that might threaten their protector and themselves. Heinrich found himself spending more time in the barn than strictly necessary, drawn by a desire for connection that his solitary existence had starved. Through Robert's translation, he learned about their lives before the war, the farms and cities they came from, the girls they had left behind, the dreams they harbored of returning home and never seeing another aircraft for as long as they lived. In turn, Heinrich told them about his son, about the farm and its history, about the Germany he had known before the madness descended. The third week brought spring thaw, and with it increased danger. The melting snow revealed the tracks Heinrich had made during his nocturnal trips to the barn, patterns in the mud that were difficult to explain away as normal farm activity. He spent an entire day deliberately creating additional tracks with his cart, moving hay and feed in broad daylight to establish a plausible reason for the increased traffic. An informant in the village had apparently reported seeing lights in Heinrich's barn at unusual hours, and a more thorough search was ordered. This time, when the SS came, they brought dogs with them, German shepherds trained to detect hidden people and contraband. Heinrich's hands trembled as he watched them approach, knowing that if the dogs alerted on the barn, everything would end in blood and screaming. But fate or fortune intervened in the form of spring weather, a sudden rainstorm that swept across the valley, soaking the ground and overwhelming the dog's senses with competing scents. The search was abbreviated, the officers irritable and wet, and they left without finding anything incriminating. By the time American forces began their final push into Bavaria, Heinrich had been harboring the pilots for 21 days. Each morning, he woke wondering if this would be the day he was discovered and executed. Each evening, he fell into exhausted sleep, amazed that he had survived another rotation of the sun. The sounds of artillery grew louder, closer, until the windows of his farmhouse rattled with the concussion of shells landing in the surrounding hills. German troops retreated through his property in disorganized columns, their faces hollow with defeat and exhaustion. Heinrich kept to his house during these passages, praying that none of them would decide to search his barn for supplies or shelter. The pilots, too, understood that liberation was imminent, but that these final hours might be the most dangerous. They had weapons now. Heinrich had found their service pistols scattered in the field where they landed and had quietly returned them, and they were prepared to fight their way out, if discovery came. But they all hoped it would not come to that this strange old German farmer who had risked everything for them would not die in the crossfire. The Americans arrived on a cool morning in early April, their tanks grinding up the rural road that led past Heinrich's farm with a mechanical inevitability that spelled the end of one era and the beginning of another. Heinrich stood in his doorway, watching the column approach, his emotions a complicated tangle of relief and apprehension and grief for the Germany he had known. When the first tank stopped at his gate, he walked out slowly, his hands visible and empty, approaching the armed soldiers with the careful movements of a man who understood how quickly situations could turn deadly. An officer jumped down from the lead vehicle, his uniform crisp despite the journey, his eyes scanning the farm with professional assessment. Heinrich tried to explain in his broken English about the pilots in the barn, but the words came out jumbled and confused. The officer's hand moved toward his sidearm, suspicious of this German farmer who seemed agitated and was babbling about Americans in his barn. It could be a trap, an ambush waiting to happen. Then Robert emerged from the barn, his hands raised, calling out in clear American English to the startled soldiers. Behind him came the other 11 pilots, thin and exhausted but alive, their appearances shocking to the troops who had known nothing of their fate. The farmyard erupted in controlled chaos as medics rushed forward and officers began barking questions, and the rescued pilots tried to explain what had happened. Heinrich stood to the side, suddenly invisible in the reunion, watching as the young men he had protected were absorbed back into their military structure. Several of them turned back to look at him, their faces showing gratitude and something deeper, but the language barrier and the press of events prevented anything more than brief nods of acknowledgment. Within an hour, the pilots were loaded into vehicles and driven away, presumably to be debriefed and evaluated and eventually sent home. Heinrich returned to his empty barn, looking at the false wall he had built, at the space where 12 men had lived in fearful silence for 3 weeks, and felt the crushing weight of loneliness settle over him once more. The war ended officially a month later, but the aftermath proved in many ways more difficult than the conflict itself. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its people devastated by defeat and the revelations of atrocities committed in their name. Heinrich worked his fields with the same methodical devotion as always, but the work felt heavier now, infused with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. His wheat grew tall and golden as summer progressed, but he knew he lacked the strength to harvest it alone. The young men from the village who might have helped were dead or scattered, and the few who remained were too occupied with their own survival to spare time for an old farmer's grain. Heinrich faced the prospect of watching his crop rot in the field, a waste that seemed emblematic of the larger waste that had consumed his country and the world. He walked through the wheat in the evening, running his weathered hands over the rippling stalks, and wondered what the point of it all had been. In late August, Heinrich was in the barn repairing a broken harness when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching. His first instinct was fear. Even with the war over, there were still roving bands of displaced persons and former soldiers who might pose a threat to an isolated farmer. He moved to the door and looked out, then froze in astonishment at what he saw. A convoy of American trucks was pulling into his farmyard, their engines rumbling, their beds filled not with soldiers, but with harvesting equipment and supplies. From the lead vehicle, Captain Robert emerged, now wearing the insignia of the military police, his face split by a broad smile. Behind him came the other 11 pilots, also in MP uniforms, and behind them came dozens of American soldiers Heinrich did not recognize. Robert approached with his hand extended, and when Heinrich took it, the younger man pulled him into an embrace that needed no translation. The Americans had come to harvest his wheat, repaying the debt they owed to the man who had saved their lives at the risk of his own. What followed was a harvest unlike any Heinrich had ever experienced, a strange and wonderful collision of former enemies working side by side in fields that had known only German hands for generations. The Americans attacked the work with the same efficiency they had brought to their military campaigns, their harvesting equipment vastly superior to Heinrich's antiquated tools. They cut and threshed and bundled the wheat with a speed that seemed almost miraculous to the old farmer, who had expected the work to take weeks, if it could be done at all. Robert stayed close to Heinrich throughout, translating when necessary, but more often simply sharing the companionable silence of men working toward a common purpose. In the evenings, the Americans camped in Heinrich's fields, their fires dotting the landscape like orange stars, their voices carrying songs in English that Heinrich did not understand but found oddly comforting. The pilots took turns visiting him in his farmhouse, bringing him gifts of chocolate and cigarettes and coffee, luxuries that had been absent from civilian life in Germany for years. The local villagers watched this spectacle with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, unable to comprehend why American soldiers would help a German farmer bring in his harvest. Rumors spread about what Heinrich must have done to deserve such treatment. Rumors that ranged from accusatory to absurd. Some suggested he had been an American spy all along, others that he had collaborated with the occupation forces in exchange for favors. Heinrich endured the whispers with the same stoic patience he had shown throughout his life, understanding that in the aftermath of such catastrophic conflict, people needed explanations for kindness that defied their expectations of how victors should treat the vanquished. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more profound than any of the rumors. He had seen young men in need and had helped them, and now they were repaying that help in the only way they could. There was no grand political calculation, no hidden agenda, just basic human decency asserting itself against the machinery of hate and war. The harvest took 10 days to complete. 10 days during which Heinrich's farm became a small island of cooperation and hope in a landscape still scarred by violence and division. The Americans worked with a will that went beyond mere obligation, throwing themselves into the labor with an enthusiasm that suggested they understood the symbolic importance of what they were doing. They were not just harvesting wheat, they were demonstrating that the bonds forged in adversity could transcend nationality and ideology, that the future need not be defined by the hatreds of the past. Heinrich found himself moved in ways he could not articulate, watching these young Americans laugh and sweat and work his land with a care that honored both the crop and the man who had grown it. Some of them were farm boys themselves, and they appreciated the quality of Heinrich's fields and the skill required to maintain them through years of wartime deprivation. They asked him questions about his methods and his crops, conversations facilitated by Robert's translation, and Heinrich answered with a quiet pride that had been absent from his life for far too long. On the final day of the harvest, when the last of the wheat had been cut and bundled and stored, the Americans organized a celebration that drew even some of the villagers out of their suspicious isolation. They roasted a pig that Heinrich contributed from his remaining livestock, and the smell of cooking meat drew people from miles around, hunger overwhelming their hesitation. The Americans shared their rations freely, opening cans of food that seemed impossibly abundant to people who had survived on scraps for years. Heinrich sat at the center of it all, overwhelmed by the attention, uncomfortable with being the focus of so much goodwill. Captain Robert made a speech, translated haltingly by one of his men, explaining what Heinrich had done and why they had come to help him. The villagers listened with varying degrees of comprehension and acceptance, but even those who remained skeptical could not deny the tangible evidence of American kindness spread before them in the form of food and fellowship and the preservation of Heinrich's harvest. As the convoy prepared to leave the next morning, Heinrich stood by the gate watching the Americans load their equipment and prepare their vehicles. Each of the 12 pilots came to say goodbye, their farewells ranging from formal handshakes to tearful embraces. They pressed letters into his hands, addresses where he could write to them if he ever needed anything, promises to stay in touch that Heinrich understood might not survive the demands of distance and time. Captain Robert was the last to leave, and he spent nearly an hour talking with Heinrich through a combination of language and gesture and shared understanding. He explained that he was putting Heinrich's name forward for recognition by the American military, that his actions deserved to be acknowledged officially and remembered. Heinrich protested weakly, insisting he had only done what any decent person would do, but Robert shook his head firmly. What Heinrich had done required extraordinary courage, the captain insisted, and courage deserved to be honored. They shook hands one final time, and then Robert climbed into his jeep and the convoy rolled out, leaving Heinrich alone once again in his farmyard. The silence after their departure felt deeper and more profound than any Heinrich had known before. He walked through his barn, now filled with the wheat they had helped him harvest, running his hands over the bundled grain that represented not just survival, but hope. The false wall was still there, a monument to 3 weeks of terror and defiance, and Heinrich found himself unable to dismantle it. It stood as evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices mattered, that compassion could assert itself against the machinery of organized hatred. In the months that followed, Heinrich would receive letters from America, from the 12 pilots who had returned to their lives but had not forgotten the old German farmer who saved them. They sent him packages of food and clothing, photographs of their families, news of their lives slowly rebuilding in peacetime. Heinrich kept these letters in a wooden box beside his bed, taking them out on lonely evenings to read and reread by lamplight, his weathered fingers tracing words in a language he barely understood, but whose meaning transcended vocabulary. The story of Heinrich Müller and the 12 pilots spread gradually through the occupation zone, becoming a parable of reconciliation in a time when such parables were desperately needed. Journalists came to interview him, their questions probing for dramatic details and moral clarity that Heinrich could not always provide. He was not a hero, he insisted, just a farmer who had made a choice, the same choice he hoped anyone would make when confronted with suffering and need. The recognition that eventually came felt burdensome to a man who had lived his entire life in quiet anonymity, but he accepted it with the same patient grace that characterized all his actions. He was invited to ceremonies and commemorations, his photograph appeared in newspapers, and his name became synonymous with the possibility of goodness persisting even through war's worst depredations. But Heinrich remained fundamentally unchanged by the attention, still rising each morning to tend his fields, still finding meaning in the rhythm of seasons and the honest labor of working the land. Years later, long after the immediate aftermath of war had faded into history, Heinrich would look back on those 21 days in the spring of 1945 as the defining period of his life, not because of the recognition that followed or the stories that were told, but because in that time he had been forced to confront the fundamental question of what kind of man he was. The Nazi regime had demanded absolute loyalty and promised severe consequences for disobedience, and Heinrich had chosen disobedience despite the risks. He had looked at 12 frightened young men and seen not enemies, but human beings in need, and he had acted on that recognition with a courage that surprised even himself. The harvest that the Americans helped him complete became a symbol of that choice, evidence that acts of compassion could generate reciprocal acts of kindness, that the cycles of violence could be broken by individuals willing to risk everything for strangers. Heinrich never regretted his decision, never wished he had made a different choice, though he understood the terrible cost it might have exacted if fortune had turned against him. In the end, Heinrich Müller lived to see Germany rebuilt from its ruins, transformed from a pariah state into a prosperous democracy integrated into the community of nations. He saw his farm continue to produce wheat and feed, saw the village of Rothhausen grow and modernize, saw the scars of war gradually fade, if never entirely disappear. Some of the 12 pilots returned to visit him over the years, their trips to Germany becoming pilgrimages to honor the man who had given them their lives back. They brought their children and later their grandchildren, introducing them to Heinrich and telling the story of the barn and the false wall and the harvest that followed. The old farmer welcomed them all with the same quiet dignity he had shown that night when he first lowered his rifle and gestured toward the barn. His hands grew more gnarled with age, his back more bent from decades of labor, but his eyes remained clear and his memory sharp. He remembered every detail of those 21 days, every face and name and moment of fear, and he carried those memories not as a burden, but as evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could persist. Heinrich Müller died in 1978 at the age of 86, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated toll of a life lived in honest labor. He was buried in the village cemetery in a plot beside his wife and son, under a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his birth and death. But his true monument stood in the stories told by those who knew him, in the letters preserved in archives, in the official commendations from American and German authorities, and most of all, in the barn where 12 men had hidden and lived because one old farmer chose compassion over compliance. The false wall remained for many years after his death, preserved as a historical artifact, a physical reminder that individual courage matters even when arrayed against overwhelming systems of cruelty and hate. Visitors came to see it, to stand in the space where those 12 young Americans had huddled in fear and hope, to contemplate the choices that define us when everything is on the line and the costs of goodness seem impossibly high. Heinrich's farm eventually passed to distant relatives who maintained it out of respect for its history, and the wheat continued to grow in fields that had witnessed both the worst and best of what humans are capable of inflicting upon one another. The story endured because it offered something the post-war world desperately needed, proof that decency could survive even when surrounded by madness, that bridges could be built across the deepest chasms of conflict, and that the simple act of seeing the humanity in an enemy could transform both the seer and the seen in ways that rippled forward through generations.